Okay, so moving on to question 5. This is looking like an ecology question about trophic levels. So let's read it. This one says the following models represent all the interacting species in 2 different communities with some of the same species and feeding relationships. These models assume that both communities have the same initial biomass. The models can be used to understand the effect of human activities on the communities. Okay. So figure 1 says models of 2 different communities with some of the same species. Okay. So you've got community A here, you've got community B here, your primary producers down here, they share some similar ones, so like PP1, PP1, PP3, PP3. Your primary consumers are the next level, and then you got secondary, and then you've got your tertiary consumers. Okay, so they share some similar organisms within their communities, but obviously there's, a difference in patterns as well as the number of species. Okay, so let's start off with A. A says, describe a characteristic of a community that makes a species invasive in that community, but not invasive in a different species. Okay, interesting. A lot of the times I will say these like trophic level ones and these ecology ones often ask you about invasive species. So before you go into the exam, that's like the number 1 application question that I ever see for that unit. Get really comfortable with invasive species, why they have such a harmful effect and certain things like that. So this is what this is asking. A characteristic of a community that makes a species invasive in that community, but not invasive in another. So what would make a community susceptible to, an invasive species? There are a couple things that you can say to these. The number 1 that I usually think about are either in the respect of like competition or predators. So for A, I'll write down all the possible options, but let's say, okay, I'm just going to use community A and community B as examples. Let's say the invasive species goes to community A, and this guy is a predator of, the invasive species. That's obviously going to decrease the population of the invasive species because there's a natural predator. If there is no natural predator in community B, the invasive species is just going to proliferate, right? There's nothing there to eat it within that ecosystem. Again, let's say SC3 is the one that eats this invasive species. There is no SC3 within community B. There is nothing to eat your invasive species. It's going to proliferate, okay? So the invasive species is going to be harmful if there's no natural predator for it in that community. Another reason is if there are no competitors, okay? So let's say that we bring the invasive species in and it has the same food source as PC1 over here. They both eat, a certain type of plant. That means that between the invasive species and PC1, there's going to be competition. So there's going to have to be some level of fitness. They're going to have to fight over resources. So that's going to significantly limit the growth of that invasive species community if it's fighting for food with another species. However, if I introduce that invasive species to community B and there's no PC1 here, if I introduce that, there is nothing stopping the invasive species from eating as much food as it can and then reproducing and spreading everywhere. So it would also be if the community doesn't have any competitors for the invasive species in terms of food. This could be in terms of shelter, any sort of resource. No competitors, no predators. And then the final one that's like a little bit more specific. I think those 2 are the main ones. You could have also said something to do with diseases. If there's no natural diseases that affect that invasive species, they're also going to proliferate very strongly, right? So that's why we don't want certain organisms from faraway places in other countries coming into our communities and our environments, because they might either bring diseases in or they're not susceptible to the diseases that our organisms are used to. Okay, so you can say write this in full sentences, but I'm going to write every option. So a characteristic of the community, there's no predators of the invasive species of put INV, invasive species, no competitors. This is only one mark, so of course you only have to write one of these. And then you could also say there's no disease susceptibility. So they're not susceptible to any of the diseases that all of these other ones are. Okay? Like if all of the crops in a certain, plot are susceptible to a certain type of disease or fungus, and you have an invasive species come in and it's not susceptible to that at all, it's not going to be affected by this disease. The disease could wipe out the whole native population. The invasive species is going to be unbothered and it's, going to be able to live. So no disease susceptibility. Again, that's to the native diseases of the community. Susceptibility. Okay, so that is a, oops, just make sure we can see that. Okay, now for B. B says, explain why removing species PP1 would have a greater effect on community B than on community A. Okay, let's go back up here. So you have primary producer 1 in community A, which is right here, and primary producer 1 in community B, which is right here. They're asking you to explain why removing this would have a greater effect on B as opposed to A. So why would the removal of PP1 affect B more strongly than it would affect A? If you look at where these are on our trophic levels, these are the primary producers. These are the ones that provide all of the energy that are going to go to the chain. These are very, very important. These are, our plants. If you are missing PP1, you only have one other candidate left to be the sole source of energy for that community. For community A, they still have 2 other sources of energy and 2 other food sources, right? And as well, if PP1 is gone, you've completely also knocked out PC2, right? PC2 in this case can also eat PP2. And so overall, you're just going to say that community B has a lot less primary producers. If you knock out one of their primary producers, you're severely affecting the amount of energy in that ecosystem and then the amount of resources that are available, right? There's just not going to be enough food for community B. Obviously, community A is not going to it's not going to be beneficial. It's not going to be great for them either, but they can have a little bit more recovery because they still have, 2 other primary producers. Okay, so the way I would say this, there's probably also a couple different ways that you can list this. I would just say, in terms of diversity, right? Biodiversity is going to be huge for, the resilience of a community. If I knock out PP1, community B has no diversity, and community A still has a little bit. Obviously still not a lot, but compared to B, it's much better. Okay, so B has less diverse, or I think you say less diverse or fewer primary producer species. And then as a result, you have to also put what this would do. So there's less diverse or fewer primary producers, and what would that cause? That would cause, less energy available because you're knocking out those primary producers. Say less energy available, or you can also say less resilience. Both of those work. Another option, which didn't immediately come to my mind, but I'm looking at the answer guide and would have allowed, is if you knocked out PP1 in community B. Let's just erase this. So if I knock this one out, you are going to see a decrease in all of these. All of these are going to plummet, right? If I knock out PP1 here, I'm not decreasing the entire chain, right? Because this is going to affect this, is going to affect this, and it affects our top producer. Even though there's still a food source here, it's going to affect the numbers of our top producers, or sorry, our top consumers. If you knock out PP1, it just basically affects less of the chain, right? Because there are so many other like energy pathways. You're only really gonna have, affect PC1 really strongly. These ones are gonna be somewhat affected, but again, because you have these two other food sources, it's gonna be more resilient. Okay, so you can say that, less diversity, you're gonna have less energy available. If there's fewer producers, there's going to be less species diversity, less resilience. And then you can also say that more, members of the chain are affected. Again, that's also just because there's less diversity. Okay. All right, so for C, it says an invasive species that eats individuals of species SC2 is introduced into community B. Using the template in the space provided for your response for community B, indicate the feeding relationship for this invasive species by correctly placing I and V to represent the invasive species and an arrow to represent the feeding relationship within community B. Okay. So let's erase all my scribbles that I've got going on here. Okay, so we're just looking at community B. We're not concerned with community A for this one. They're saying that an invasive species eats individuals of species SC2. Okay, so it's going to eat SC2. Indicate the feeding relationship for this invasive species by correctly placing I and V to represent the invasive species and an arrow to represent the feeding relationship. Okay, so what this would look like is, I'm going to do this and I'll do it in red. I and V, this. Okay, so this is really just about your ability to understand the way that these diagrams work. So our invasive species is eating SC2. It's going to be higher in the trophic levels or in the pyramid of this community. In terms of the arrows, just be mindful. The arrows are pointing towards the higher consumer. That's why I didn't do it this way, because that would indicate that SC2 eats INV. So you have to put the arrow in the correct position, right? Because this one over here is eating SC2. This one is also eating SC2. So the arrows have to go in the same way to indicate those are the ones that are the top consumers. Okay, so that one was very straightforward. You had to label it and then also put the correct arrow. Okay, the last one says, explain how human activities that add toxins to the soil could change a community with many species at each trophic level, such as community A, into a community with few species at each trophic level, such as community B. Okay, let me just erase this so that I can get a little bit more room. Okay. So how does the addition of toxins change a community with many species? How human activities that add toxins to the soil could change a community with many species at each trophic level, such as community A, into a community with fewer species at each trophic level. Okay, I'm understanding the question now. I didn't know if they were asking you to look at them individually. They're asking basically how could the addition of toxins turn a community from looking like this, so a very, relatively diverse community, into something like this that's a lot less diverse. So it's really just asking you how the addition of toxins into the soil, for example, are going to reduce species diversity. Okay, that's really all it's asking. How does this turn into this because of toxins? So this is specifically toxins in the soil. So what is that going to affect? It's going to affect our primary producers, right? All of our plants, which are at the very bottom of the food chain. All of the plants are now growing in basically toxic soil. Because they're at the bottom of the food chain, you're then affecting everything on top of, going upwards. Your primary consumers, secondary, and tertiary. So there's a couple different things you can say for this one. The addition of toxins can either eliminate the primary producers, so they in this case, what PP2 could have just like gone extinct or just died from the community because maybe it just has a lower tolerance maybe than PP1 and PP3. So you could say that the toxins eliminate primary producers, and that as a result reduces species diversity, because if I knock out PP2, I'm affecting PC2, PC3, and I'm affecting these ones up here, and I'm affecting all the tertiary consumers. So toxins eliminate primary producers, reducing species diversity. Slash, you can also say like affecting energy available, right? Less primary producers, less energy. Another thing that you can say that we do go over at like the very end of the curriculum is the idea of biomagnification. So if anybody remembers biomagnification, it was the idea that toxins in the environment get magnified at every trophic level, right? So if you're at the top of the food chain, you are ingesting the most amount of toxins, right? It's going to increase every single time because of the amount of food you're eating, right? A mouse is going to eat a lot less food than a human. If there is a certain amount of toxin per gram, let's say, the mouse is going to ingest a lot less toxin than you are, just based off of the pure amount of food that you're eating. So that's biomagnification. So you could have also said this, that the activities could cause biomagnification, which means that, you know, all of the upper trophic levels are going to gradually get more and more toxin built up in them. That's going to affect, obviously, species diversity. So this is another option. Again, you only have to say one of them. So biomagnification. It's not enough to say biomagnification. What is that going to do? And how does that turn community A into B? Biomagnification, you can say reduces species diversity. Okay, you say at higher trophic levels. Actually, be a little bit more specific. Because biomagnification refers to the upper trophic levels. You don't have to say that for D because it's kind of already said that you're talking about eliminating the primary producers. In this case, you're going to be affecting the higher up consumers because of biomagnification. Okay, so that is it for 5. This one wasn't too bad. And this one was also worth 4 marks, 1 for each part.